In the depths of a small New England town lies the abandoned remains of Cedar Hill Asylum, a place steeped in myth and shadows. Every child in the surrounding area grew up hearing stories about the horrors that transpired there. Experiments on the mentally ill, whispered accounts of demonic possessions, and patients vanishing into thin air. When the property was condemned in the 1970s, the rumors only grew darker. But it wasn't until 2024, when a hiker stumbled upon an old, leather-bound diary near the asylum grounds, that the town's dark history began to resurface. The diary belonged to Dr. Edwin Harkness, the asylum's chief psychiatrist from 1923 to 1929. While the early entries detailed mundane observations about the patients, the final entries spoke of something unnatural, a phenomenon he called the whispering plague. The entries hinted at voices that patients claimed to hear, voices so compelling they drove people to madness. Dr. Harkness believed the voices came from something ancient that resided in the surrounding pinewoods, something the asylum had accidentally awakened. No one believed the hiker's story about the diary, especially when he claimed the pages seemed to change every time he opened it. But then he disappeared. A week later, 3 college students, Emma, Jake, and Claire, decided to investigate the asylum. Jake had heard about the diary on a true crime podcast and was determined to prove it was a hoax. They arrived at Cedar Hill just after sunset, armed with flashlights, cameras, and a sense of invincibility that only comes with youth. The asylum was more decayed than they expected. Vines crawled up the crumbling walls, and the air smelled of mildew and rot. As they entered the main hall, Claire gasped. Scrawled across the wall in smeared, dark red paint were the words, "The pines speak when the sky bleeds." Emma dismissed it as graffiti from thrill seekers, but Jake was visibly uneasy. He insisted they find the diary, convinced it would be the key to unraveling the mystery. In the asylum's library, they found shelves lined with dust-covered books and medical records. Emma spotted a single book lying open on a table. The leather cover was embossed with the initials EH, Dr. Edwin Harkness. Jake eagerly flipped through the diary, his eyes scanning the pages. One entry caught his attention. "Once you hear the whispers, you cannot silence them. The pinewoods are their prison, but the chains are weakening. If you value your soul, stay away." Then they heard it, a soft, melodic whispering. It seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The whispers grew louder as they ventured deeper into the asylum. Jake's bravado was fading, replaced by an edge of panic. "It's just the wind," Claire said, though her voice trembled. In the basement, they found a series of cells where patients had been kept. The walls were etched with frantic scrawls, "Don't listen," "IT knows your name," and most disturbingly, "The pines are watching." The whispers became distinct words, calling to each of them in a voice only they could hear. For Jake, it was his mother's voice, soft and pleading. For Claire, it was her late brother, begging for help. Emma heard nothing at first, only a ringing in her ears, but her stomach churned with inexplicable dread. Then they saw it, a shadow shifting unnaturally in the corner of the room. It moved toward them, not walking but gliding, its form humanoid but twisted. Where its face should have been was a gaping void, a blackness so complete it hurt to look at. Jake screamed and bolted, leaving the others behind. Emma and Claire tried to follow, but the asylum seemed to shift around them, hallways stretching and twisting into impossible configurations. The whispers were no longer faint. They were deafening, a cacophony of voices pleading, mocking and commanding. They stumbled into the courtyard, where they found Jake. He was standing perfectly still, staring at the pinewoods beyond the asylum's gates. His flashlight lay on the ground, its beam illuminating a circle of freshly dug graves. Emma approached cautiously. "Jake?" she whispered. He turned slowly, his face pale and his eyes wide with terror. "It's in the trees," he murmured. "It's always been in the trees." Before they could respond, the pinewoods came alive. Shadows danced between the trunks, and the air vibrated with an otherworldly hum. The trees seemed to move, leaning toward the asylum as if drawn by some invisible force. Then came the figure, a towering silhouette with impossibly long limbs and glowing eyes like burning coals. It pointed one spindly finger toward the group, and the whispers turned into screams. Emma and Claire ran, dragging a dazed Jake with them. Somehow they made it back to town, but the whispers followed. They heard them in their dreams, in the rustling of leaves, even in the static of their phones. 2 days later, Claire was found dead in her apartment, her ears bleeding. Jake vanished without a trace. Emma, now the sole survivor, returned to Cedar Hill in desperation, clutching the diary. She wrote her final entry in shaky handwriting. "If you're reading this, it's too late. The pines have chosen you. They don't just whisper, they hunt. Leave now while you still can. Burn this place. Burn the woods, before it spreads." When authorities found the diary, Emma was gone. But scrawled beneath her final words, in handwriting that did not belong to her, was a single chilling sentence. "The pines are patient. They will wait for you." To this day, locals swear they can hear whispers when the wind blows through the pine woods. Most stay far away, but thrill seekers occasionally venture into the asylum, hoping to catch a glimpse of the supernatural. None have returned. It started with an invitation. No return address, no signature, just a black envelope with gold lettering delivered to the doorstep of Eleanor Barnes, a 35-year-old journalist from Boston. "You are cordially invited to witness the wonders of Blackthorn Hill. Midnight, October 31st. Do not be late." Most would dismiss such an invitation as a Halloween prank. But for Eleanor, a lover of mysteries and unsolved stories, this was irresistible. Blackthorn Hill was infamous, a sprawling Victorian mansion on the outskirts of town that had been abandoned for over a century. No one knew who built it or why it had been left to decay. Rumors spoke of dark rituals, strange lights, and people who entered but never returned. Eleanor packed her camera and a flashlight, ready to debunk the myth. As she drove up the winding, fog-covered road, the mansion emerged from the mist. Blackthorn House loomed against the night sky, its windows like dark eyes. The iron gate swung open on its own with a slow, creaking groan. Something in Eleanor's gut told her to turn back, but curiosity was louder than fear. Eleanor stepped through the front door, her footsteps echoing in the vast, empty foyer. The air was cold and heavy, as though the house itself were holding its breath. Cobwebs draped over grand chandeliers, and the faded wallpaper peeled like dying skin. On the far wall, an antique grandfather clock stood, its pendulum swinging slowly. 11:59 p.m. She took a photo, the flash illuminating the room for a split second. When the light faded, Eleanor felt a chill run down her spine. The room felt different, as if someone or something was watching. The clock struck midnight. The chimes were deafening, echoing through the house. The moment the 12th chime rang out, every candle in the room ignited at once, bathing the foyer in a flickering, golden glow, and the front door slammed shut behind her. Eleanor spun around, her heart pounding. She pulled at the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. The lock was ice cold against her fingers. Then she heard it, the murmur of voices. She turned back to the foyer and gasped. The room was no longer empty. Elegant figures dressed in Victorian evening wear filled the space, their faces obscured by elaborate masks. Wolves, ravens, serpents, and owls. They moved with eerie grace, gliding rather than walking. Their conversations were a lilting murmur, a language just beyond comprehension. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. She knew these people couldn't be real. They were too pale, too still, like marionettes animated by invisible strings. One figure stepped forward, a tall man in a raven mask. He bowed slightly. "Welcome to Blackthorn House, Miss Barnes. We've been expecting you." Her voice shook. Who are you?" He chuckled softly. We are the uninvited, the ones who linger where they shouldn't. And tonight, you are our guest. A haunting melody filled the room, played by an unseen orchestra. The masked figures began to dance, a waltz that was mesmerizing in its precision and eeriness. Their feet made no sound against the marble floor. The man in the raven mask extended his hand to Eleanor. "Join us." She shook her head, backing away. "I don't belong here, but you do. You accepted the invitation." Eleanor's vision blurred. Her limbs felt heavy, her mind clouded. The music wrapped around her like a vine, tightening its grip. Against her will, she placed her hand in his. The moment they touched, the room changed. The decayed grandeur of the house transformed into a ballroom of dazzling splendor. Crystal chandeliers, velvet drapes, walls lined with gold. The dancers were no longer ghostly figures but vibrant, laughing people, and Eleanor was wearing an ornate mask. She wanted to scream, but her body moved on its own, swept up in the dance. The music grew faster, wilder. The laughter turned to shrieks of glee that bordered on hysteria. When she glanced at her partner, the raven mask was gone. His face was a hollow void, a swirling blackness that threatened to pull her in. The dance continued, endless and exhausting. Eleanor's feet ached, her vision dimming. The other dancers' faces were dissolving, their masks melting into their skin. She realized with horror that they were trapped, just as she was, guests who had once accepted the same invitation. Desperate, she whispered, "I want to leave." The void-faced man leaned in close, his voice like dead leaves rustling. "Curiosity brought you here, and curiosity must be paid for." With all her strength, Eleanor tore the mask from her face. Pain seared through her skull, as though her very identity were being ripped away. The ballroom shattered like glass, the illusions falling apart. She was back in the decaying foyer, alone and gasping for breath. The clock read 3 a.m. The front door stood ajar. Without looking back, she sprinted out into the foggy night, the mansion's cold presence clawing at her heels. Eleanor never spoke of that night. She quit her job, moved to a new city, and tried to forget. But on her doorstep one autumn morning lay a black envelope with gold lettering. Her hands shook as she opened it. "We miss you, Eleanor. Midnight, October 31st. Blackthorn Hill awaits." She burned the letter, but the scent of smoke and decay lingered in her home for days. In the towns surrounding Blackthorn Hill, people still talk of the mysterious invitations that appear every Halloween. Some dismiss them as pranks. Others know better. They know that once you dance in Blackthorn House, the invitation never truly ends. In 1987, the Starlight Motel sat at the edge of Route 66, forgotten by the world. Its peeling neon sign flickered faintly, casting eerie shadows on the cracked parking lot. Most nights, the place was empty, except for the occasional weary traveler or those running from something they couldn't leave behind. Jack Larson, a 42-year-old truck driver, was one such traveler. He pulled into the Starlight just after sunset, his CB radio dead and his truck sputtering from a failing engine. Exhausted, he paid for a room, the infamous room 313. The desk clerk, a gaunt man with hollow eyes, hesitated before handing over the key. "Don't use the radio," he muttered. Jack shrugged it off as small-town superstition and headed to his room. Room 313 was as drab as he expected. Stained carpet, a creaky bed, and a small table with an old, crackling shortwave radio. Jack tossed his bag on the bed and turned the radio on out of habit. Static hissed through the room. As he adjusted the dial, a voice broke through. "Can you hear me?" Jack froze. He checked the frequency. It didn't match any known station. Curious, he leaned closer. "Please, if you're there, help me." Jack tried to respond, but the radio had no microphone. The voice, a woman's voice, continued. "I don't know where I am. It's dark, and there's something here with me." The static grew louder, the voice more frantic. Jack turned the dial again, but the station disappeared, replaced by a high-pitched whine. He switched off the radio, trying to convince himself it was a prank or interference. Still, the desperation in her voice stuck with him. Later that night, as he lay in bed, the radio turned on by itself. Jack. His blood ran cold. "Who's there?" he demanded, but his voice felt small in the dark room. "Jack, please. They're watching me." Before he could respond, the radio emitted a guttural growl, a sound so unnatural it made his teeth ache. Then silence. The next morning, Jack confronted the desk clerk. "What's with the radio in 313? The clerk paled. "You shouldn't have turned it on." "Why? What's going on here?" Reluctantly, the clerk shared the motel's grim history. In 1965, a woman named Grace Mathers had disappeared from room 313. Her car was found in the parking lot, but there was no sign of her. Guests started reporting strange occurrences in the room. Static-filled radios, whispers in the night, and pleas for help. Most left in the middle of the night, vowing never to return. "People say she's trapped," the clerk said. "In the radio." Jack laughed nervously. "That's ridiculous." The clerk's expression didn't change. "Leave if you want, but if the radio calls you again, don't answer." That evening, Jack planned to leave, but his truck wouldn't start. Frustrated, he returned to the room to wait for a tow. The radio sat on the table, silent but looming. Unable to resist, he turned it on. The static was deafening, but beneath it, he heard Grace again. "He's here. He's coming." "Who? Who's coming?" Jack asked, his voice shaking. "The broadcaster. He's always watching, always listening." The lights flickered. A cold wind swept through the room, though the windows were shut. Jack grabbed the radio, shaking it. "What do you want from me?" The static shifted into a low, distorted chuckle. "Stay tuned, Jack." Suddenly, the room went dark. When the lights came back, Jack was no longer in room 313. He was standing in a vast, pitch-black void. A faint red glow illuminated a massive, broken tower that jutted into the sky like a jagged claw. The radio in his hands crackled to life. "Welcome to my frequency," a deep, malevolent voice intoned. "You shouldn't have listened." Jack turned to see a figure standing near the tower, a tall, shadowy man with a head like an old-fashioned radio dial. His face flickered with static, and his long, spindly fingers crackled with electricity. Grace's voice cut through the static. "Run!" Jack sprinted, but the broadcaster moved faster, his limbs elongating unnaturally as he pursued. The ground beneath Jack's feet began to vibrate, each step echoing like a drumbeat. He tripped, landing hard as the broadcaster loomed over him. "Every listener becomes a signal," the broadcaster said, his voice warping into a sinister hiss. "And every signal is mine." Jack screamed as the figure reached for him, static flooding his ears and his vision going white. Jack woke up in room 313, gasping for breath. The radio was silent. For a brief moment, he thought it was all a nightmare. Then he saw his reflection in the cracked mirror. His eyes glowed faintly red, and faint static buzzed in his ears. When he spoke, his voice sounded hollow, as though it came from the other end of a broadcast. Desperate, he smashed the radio to pieces, but the sound of static persisted, louder now, emanating from within him. He stumbled out of the motel, clutching his chest as the sensation grew unbearable. As he reached his truck, the dashboard radio crackled to life. "You're tuned in now, Jack. Forever." Weeks later, travelers passing through Route 66 began reporting strange broadcasts on their radios. A man's voice, garbled and filled with static, would interrupt their stations. "If you hear this, don't listen. Don't." The signal would cut off, replaced by eerie, distorted laughter. Room 313 at the Starlight Motel remains vacant, but the radio always crackles to life at midnight, waiting for its next listener.
Thanks for listening to today's story. Let us know what you think. If you want to hear more scary stories, Be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new episode when we upload it. We'll always be here and welcome you.